5 women had tried before her. 5 women had packed their hopes into wagons, traveled miles into the cold mountains, and thought they could handle the man who lived there. None of them lasted longer than a week. The stories about him spread fast, how he lived alone for years, how even the wild animals kept their distance, and how no woman could stand his silence or his temper. People in town said he didn't need a wife. He needed a miracle, but that didn't stop the next one from coming. She was different the moment she stepped off the carriage, not the kind of woman anyone expected. Heavier, slower, with a face that showed neither fear nor excitement. The people at the station whispered, some laughed under their breath. "She won't last 3 days," one man said. The woman didn't look at them. She simply lifted her small trunk, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the mountain trail like she had something to prove. The man she was going to marry wasn't waiting with flowers or a smile. He stood there like a wall, arms crossed, hat shadowing his eyes. His beard was thick, his coat torn at the edges, and his boots were covered in dust. He looked at her once, then turned toward his horse without a word. She followed. It was a quiet ride up the mountain, the wind their only company. Every mile made the air colder and the silence heavier. When they reached his cabin, it wasn't much to look at. Logs stacked together, smoke rising weakly from the chimney and snow creeping toward the porch. Inside, it smelled of wood and ash, not warmth. He showed her where she'd sleep, pointed to a small stove, then went back outside to chop firewood. No welcome, no words, just the sound of the axe breaking the frozen air. Most women would have cried. Most would have turned the horse around before nightfall. But she didn't. She took off her gloves, unpacked her things, and started cooking without asking. When he came back in, sweat and frost mixing on his face, the smell of warm bread filled the room. He stopped silent, his hand still on the doorframe. The woman didn't look up. She just said, calm and sure, "You'll eat before the fire dies." The mountain man had a name, but no one in town used it anymore. To them, he was just the mountain man asterisk. A man who spoke few words, worked from sunrise to nightfall, and preferred the company of trees and silence over people. His cabin sat high above the valley, where snow stayed long after spring came, and where the wolves howled loud enough to shake the windows at night. No one knew why he lived there alone, and no one was brave enough to ask. Some said he'd lost someone long ago, others said he never had anyone to lose. Whatever the reason, it had hardened him, layer by layer, until his heart seemed made of stone. When the first mail-order bride arrived, she lasted only 3 days. She couldn't stand the cold or the quiet. She'd thought life in the mountains would be romantic, fires, stars, adventure. What she found instead was frost biting her fingers, endless chores, and a husband who barely looked at her. On the morning of the 4th day, she was gone, leaving behind a torn dress and a note no one could read through the smudges of her tears. The second bride was stronger. She was a farmer's daughter used to hard work. For a few days, things seemed fine. But one night the wind screamed through the cracks in the cabin, and she woke to find him sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. She asked what was wrong, and he told her to go back to sleep. When she pressed him again, his voice turned sharp, and something in his eyes made her blood run cold. She left before sunrise, walking the mountain trail alone until someone from town found her shivering near the river. The third one tried to change him. She brought lace curtains, a painted plate, and a small Bible. She talked to him about forgiveness and new beginnings, but he said nothing. Her soft voice filled the cabin for a week, but every word bounced off the walls and fell flat. By the 6th day, she stopped talking altogether. On the 7th, she rode away without saying goodbye. The 4th bride didn't even make it through the first storm. The mountain was cruel that winter. The snow piled high, the firewood ran low, and she realized too late that survival here wasn't about hope, it was about grit. The man didn't comfort her when she cried. He simply handed her an axe and told her to work. She threw it down in anger, shouting that she wasn't some servant. He didn't shout back. He just went outside and didn't come in until she was gone. The 5th was the youngest, barely more than a girl, sent by her family to secure a future. She was sweet and kind, the kind of person who saw beauty in everything, even in him. For a moment he seemed softer, almost human, but the mountain takes what it wants. A week in, a storm rolled through, trapping them inside for 3 days. By the time it cleared, her spirit had broken. The silence, the cold, the endless shadow of him, it was too much. She returned to town without a word. After that, no one volunteered. The man's name, the one he'd once written in letters to the agency, became a warning. No one dared to reply to his ads anymore. Until her. Her letter had been short and plain. No flowery words, no desperate tone. She wrote that she could cook, clean, and work hard, that she didn't mind solitude, and most of all, she didn't scare easy. When the letter reached him, he almost tossed it into the fire. But something about the last line caught his eye. "I don't expect kindness, only honesty." When she arrived, the townsfolk stared. She wasn't what anyone expected for a mountain bride. Broad-shouldered, full-figured, and heavy in her steps, she looked nothing like the women before her. Her cheeks were round, her dress plain, her hair tied back in a way that made her look practical, not pretty. The whispers started as soon as she stepped down. "She'll never make it up there. He'll scare her off like the rest. She's not the type to climb mountains." She didn't look at them, didn't answer. Just picked up her trunk, nodded to the driver, and waited for her new husband. When he appeared, tall and rough like a shadow carved from the mountain itself, she met his stare without flinching. Their first exchange was nothing more than a nod. He didn't offer to carry her bag, and she didn't expect him to. The ride to his cabin was long and quiet. The trail wound through steep paths and dark forests, the air growing colder with each turn. She didn't complain once, though her hands trembled in the wind. When they reached the cabin, she looked around slowly. Smoke rose from the chimney, but the place looked lonely, like it had forgotten laughter. Inside, the air smelled of wood, smoke, and solitude. She set her trunk down and looked around. He gestured toward a small room in the corner. "You'll sleep there," he said simply. She nodded and went about unpacking. He watched her for a moment, maybe expecting her to break down, to cry, to ask when they'd go back to town. She didn't. Instead, she wiped dust from the table, set a small pot on the stove, and began to move as if she already belonged there. Later that evening, when he returned from chopping wood, the smell of stew filled the cabin. She didn't look up when he entered. "It's ready," she said. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. He sat down without a word, tasting the food in silence. It was the first real meal he'd had in weeks. When he glanced at her, she was watching the fire, her face calm, her eyes reflecting the light. For the first time in a long while, the cabin felt less empty. He didn't know it yet, but the woman sitting across from him wasn't going to leave. Not in a day, not in a week, not at all. And somewhere deep inside, under layers of ice and pride, a small crack began to form. The first morning in the mountains came quiet and sharp. The air bit her skin the moment she stepped outside, but she didn't flinch. Her breath turned white in the cold as she looked over the valley below, where the mist still clung to the trees. The mountain man was already awake, chopping wood near the edge of the cabin. Each strike of his axe echoed against the stillness. She watched for a moment, noting the rhythm in his movements, precise, strong, almost mechanical. Then she turned and began her own work. Inside, the fire had burned low and frost gathered on the window edges. She stirred the embers, added kindling, and started breakfast. The stove hissed as she laid down strips of bacon, the smell drifting out through the open door. The man didn't look up from his chopping, but she saw his shoulders shift slightly at the scent. When he finally came in, he said nothing, just took his place at the table. She didn't greet him either. They ate in silence. After the meal, she washed the dishes, humming softly under her breath. It wasn't a song anyone would know, just a tune to fill the quiet. The sound caught him off guard. It had been years since he'd heard a woman's voice in that cabin. The first few brides had cried. The third had prayed. None had ever hummed. He looked up briefly as if to ask why she bothered, but she didn't meet his eyes. She kept working, calm and steady, the sound fading only when she finished. That day set the pattern. He worked outside, hauling logs, fixing fences, checking traps, while she worked inside, cleaning, mending, cooking, making order from years of neglect. They rarely spoke, but something about her presence filled the empty spaces that had once echoed with loneliness. When he came in at dusk, he'd find the fire lit and food waiting. She never smiled, never asked questions, never demanded thanks. She just did what needed doing as if she had lived there her whole life. By the end of the first week, he realized something strange. She hadn't complained. Not once. The others had complained about the cold, about the food, about him. But she just worked day after day, her pace steady, her spirit unshaken. He caught himself watching her sometimes, how she moved, how she carried her weight like it meant nothing, how her hands were always busy. She wasn't fragile like the others. She wasn't scared of the dark or the silence. She seemed to belong to it, like she'd known hardship long before she met him. One afternoon, a storm rolled in fast. The sky turned gray, the wind howled through the trees, and the first flakes of snow fell thick and wet. He went out to secure the woodpile, shouting for her to stay inside. But she was already at the door, pulling on her coat. "You'll freeze," he barked. She met his eyes, her voice calm but firm. "Then we'll freeze together. Hand me the rope." He hesitated, more from surprise than anger. No one had ever spoken to him like that. She took the rope from his hands before he could argue and started tying the stack, her fingers moving quickly despite the cold. The snow whipped around them, sticking to her hair and lashes, but she didn't stop. When the last knot was tied, she wiped her hands on her apron and turned back toward the cabin. "You're slow," she said with a faint smirk before stepping inside. That night the storm raged on, but the cabin was warm. He sat by the fire, his hands rough and cracked, staring at her as she patched a tear in her skirt. "You've done this before," he said quietly. It wasn't really a question, but she looked up anyway. "Hard work," she replied. "All my life." She didn't explain more, and he didn't ask. For the first time, though, his voice didn't sound sharp. It sounded curious. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm between them settled into something unspoken. She began waking before him, feeding the chickens he'd long ignored, cleaning corners of the cabin he hadn't seen in years. He started chopping extra wood, fixing things around the cabin without being asked. They didn't talk about it, but both noticed. The air between them softened, even if neither would admit it. Sometimes, when she cooked, he'd linger by the doorway a little longer, watching the steam rise from the pot, watching her hands move with quiet skill. He found himself wanting to speak, to say something, anything. But the words caught in his throat. She didn't seem to expect them anyway. It was as if she already understood the kind of man he was, and she had made peace with it. One evening she found him sitting outside on the porch, staring out at the fading light. He didn't notice her at first. When she came beside him, he glanced up, half expecting her to scold him for sitting in the cold. But she just handed him a mug of hot coffee and sat down next to him. They watched the sun slip behind the ridge in silence. After a while he said, "You're tougher than most." She sipped her coffee, her breath rising in soft clouds. "Maybe, or maybe I just don't quit easy." That line hung in the air between them. It wasn't pride, it was truth. And for the first time in years he felt something stir deep inside him, something he thought he'd buried long ago. Respect. In town, people were still talking. They expected her to return any day, claiming the mountain man was impossible. But the days turned into weeks, and she didn't come back. Instead, a traveler passing through said he saw smoke rising from the cabin, steady and strong, like someone had finally made a home there. The story reached the general store, the saloon, the church steps. "She's still up there," they'd whisper. "How long has it been now?" "Almost a month," someone would answer. A month. None of the others made it a week. The town didn't know it, but that quiet woman in the green dress wasn't just surviving the mountain, she was changing it. And whether the man knew it or not, the silence he'd lived in for so long had started to sound different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, with footsteps, with the scrape of pots, with the low hum of her voice drifting through the cabin like a song that refused to fade. The first real test came when winter sank its teeth deep into the mountains. Snow buried the paths, wind howled down the valley like a wild animal, and the cold crept into everything. Even the wood seemed to groan from it. Most winters, the mountain man endured it alone, speaking to no one, moving through the dark months like a ghost. But that year was different. There was another pair of footsteps beside his, another breath beside the fire, another set of hands that didn't tremble when work got hard. She adapted faster than he expected. When the storm came, she didn't hide from it. She layered blankets over the windows, stacked wood high by the hearth, and made sure the chickens were sheltered before nightfall. He watched her from the doorway, half waiting for her to panic the way the others had. But she never did. Her movements were firm, practiced, as if she'd lived through worse. The mountain man said little, only nodded once when she came back in with snow tangled in her hair. The nights grew longer. The days shrank into a few short hours of gray light. Sometimes he caught her standing by the window, staring at the white-covered world outside. Her face looked thoughtful, not afraid, like someone remembering an old story. One evening while they ate by the fire, he asked, "Don't you miss it? The town, the noise?" She looked up, chewing slowly. "Noise never meant company," she said. "I prefer the kind that listens." He didn't answer, but those words stayed with him. It was strange, how easily she fit into the silence that had driven so many away. She didn't fill it with chatter or complaints. She didn't demand conversation. She let the quiet stretch and breathe, and somehow it stopped feeling empty. He found himself speaking more than he intended, small things at first, about the traps he set, the storm coming from the north, how the wolves moved in packs this time of year. She never interrupted, just listened, eyes steady, as if every word mattered. Then came the night of the accident. The snow had fallen heavy all day, and the man decided to check one of his traps before dark. She told him to wait, said the storm wasn't done yet, but stubbornness was something they shared. He went anyway. Hours passed and the light faded. When she looked out the window, there was nothing but white swirling against white. The mountain could swallow a man whole without a sound. She waited by the door, pacing, her breath clouding in the cold. When he didn't return, she didn't think twice. She threw on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and took a lantern. The wind slapped at her, the snow stung her cheeks, but she pressed forward, calling his name. The sound vanished into the storm, but she kept shouting, her voice raw, her legs heavy in the drifts. After what felt like hours, she spotted a shape in the snow, still, dark, half buried. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she dropped to her knees beside him. He was breathing, but barely. The cold had taken hold of his hands, his face pale as the ground beneath him. "Don't you dare," she muttered through chattering teeth, gripping his coat. "Don't you dare quit now." It took every bit of strength she had to drag him back through the snow, step by painful step. When they reached the cabin, she pulled him inside, ripped off his frozen coat, and pushed him toward the fire. For hours she worked to bring him back. She rubbed his hands, wrapped him in blankets, fed the fire until it roared. When he stirred at last, his voice was weak, hoarse. "You came after me." She didn't stop moving. "Someone had to," she said. "You'd be frozen stiff if I hadn't." He tried to smile but winced instead. "I told you not to follow." She looked at him then, really looked, her eyes steady and fierce. "And I told you I don't quit easy." That night changed something between them. The walls of the cabin seemed warmer, the silence softer. He watched her as she sat by the fire, exhaustion etched across her face but her posture straight as ever. He realized then that she wasn't just surviving the mountain, she was fighting it, same as him. Maybe harder. And for the first time in years, he felt something break open inside him, something small but undeniable. Gratitude. The next morning when she woke, the fire was already lit. He was outside, chopping wood again, but slower this time. When he came in, he handed her a mug of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was something, a wordless thank you. She accepted it without a smile, just a quiet nod as if she understood. From then on, the rhythm between them shifted. He started fixing things around the cabin that had been broken for years. A loose step, a cracked window, the roof that leaked in the corner. She noticed but never commented. In return, she began adding touches of her own: fresh curtains, small wildflowers in a tin can on the table, a patchwork quilt over the bed. Slowly, the cabin stopped looking like a shelter and started feeling like a home. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt, they stood outside watching the ice slide off the roof. The air was crisp but kinder now. He said almost to himself, "You're not like the others." She turned to him, her face calm. "No, I suppose I'm not." There was no arrogance in her tone, just truth. She wasn't fragile or delicate or easily scared. Her strength wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. And he knew then that she was the first person who truly belonged in those mountains beside him. In town, rumors kept swirling. People said the mountain man had finally lost his edge. Some said he'd gone soft. Others said the woman had bewitched him. But those who passed through the valley sometimes saw smoke curling from the chimney, steady and strong. They heard laughter once or twice, faint but real. The woman had found something in the mountain man that no one else had seen, a heart that had been frozen, not dead. And though he rarely spoke, there were moments when his eyes softened as they met hers, the kind of look that said more than words ever could. The snow would come again, as it always did. The cold would bite, the wind would roar, and the world would try to break them. But now there were two fires burning in that cabin, one in the hearth, and one that neither of them had expected to find. Summer on the mountain was short, but when it came, the world seemed to breathe again. Wildflowers painted the slopes, streams sparkled under the sun, and the sharp bite of the cold softened for a while. The cabin, once bleak and lonely, now looked alive. A garden sprouted near the porch. Chickens scratched freely in the yard. Tools leaned neatly against the wall, worn from use but cared for. It was no longer just his place. It was theirs. The change hadn't come all at once. It had crept in slowly, like sunlight slipping through cracks. One evening, he noticed her laughter echoing through the trees as she called the hens. Another morning, she caught him fixing the chair she used by the fire, sanding it smooth so it wouldn't snag her dress. Small things, unspoken things, but together they made the cabin warmer than it had ever been. Word reached the town that she was still up there, thriving where no one else could. Curiosity grew. Some said she must be a fool. Others whispered she had bewitched him. A few simply admitted what none wanted to believe, that she was stronger than the others had ever been. When traders passed through, they told of smoke rising steady from the chimney, of a woman with her sleeves rolled up, working beside the mountain man as though she belonged there. One day she and the man rode into town together for supplies. Heads turned the moment they arrived. The mountain man, silent and grim as always, dismounted and tied his horse. She stepped down beside him, her face calm, her stride steady. Whispers chased them through the street. Some laughed at her size, others pitied her, but she didn't lower her eyes. She walked into the store, made her purchases, and left with dignity. He noticed. He also noticed how the whispers followed them out, and for the first time in years, his jaw tightened with something other than anger at the world. It was anger for her. That night, as they unloaded their goods at the cabin, he spoke more than usual. "They don't see what I see," he muttered, stacking sacks of flour. She raised a brow but said nothing. He didn't elaborate, but she understood. He was no poet, no man of fine words, but his tone was enough. In that moment, she knew he had begun to stand with her, not just beside her. The summer brought new tests. Bears wandered close, drawn by the scent of livestock. Once, she found herself face to face with one while fetching water. Fear clawed at her throat, but she stood her ground until the man appeared with his rifle. The bear fled, leaving only trampled grass behind. That night by the fire, she admitted her legs had nearly given out. He studied her quietly, then said, "Still, you didn't run." His voice carried something like respect, rare but unmistakable. Another test came with sickness. She fell ill one evening, fever burning her skin, her breath shallow. Panic clawed at him, though he didn't show it. He sat by her side, wiping her forehead, forcing broth past her lips, keeping the fire blazing all through the night. Days passed before she opened her eyes fully, weak but alive. When she did, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She tried to speak, but he only shook his head. Rest. You've done enough. It was the closest thing to tenderness he had ever spoken aloud. Through all this, their bond grew, quiet, steady, undeniable. He began to consult her before decisions, asking which seeds to plant, which fence to mend first. She began to trust his silence, knowing it was not indifference but thought. The two of them, once strangers bound by paper and expectation, had become something far more, partners forged by hardship. The town, of course, could not ignore it. When word spread that she had lasted not just a week, but many months, the story turned into legend. Children whispered about the obese bride who tamed the mountain man. Men laughed in disbelief. Women argued about whether it was strength or foolishness. Yet no one could deny the truth. She had done what none before her could. She had stayed. By autumn, the valley glowed gold and red. The air sharpened again, warning of another winter on the way. She stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip low, her baby garden now ripe with harvest. He came to stand beside her, arms crossed, face shadowed as always. For a long time they said nothing. Then, in his rough, gravel voice, he murmured, "Didn't think anyone could last here." She glanced at him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "That's because you didn't know me yet." He didn't reply, but something in his eyes softened, and for her, that was enough. She turned back toward the horizon, the weight of his presence beside her steady as the mountain itself. The cabin glowed warm behind them, the smoke rising straight into the evening sky. Wolves howled in the distance, but they no longer sounded like a threat. Not with two fires burning in that cabin. Not with two souls who had finally found a place where they belonged. And so the story spread. The tale of the man no woman could endure, and the bride who refused to leave. A story of grit, silence, and stubborn hearts. A story of strength not measured by appearances, but by the will to stay when everyone else had walked away.